many here by show of hands like food? Anybody? Yes. It looks like just about everybody, right? All right, well, I have a friend, let's call my friend Timmy, who absolutely adores food. In fact, he has a tendency to be a little bit overprotective of his food. He told me a story one time of his 7th birthday party. He was at an ice skating rink, and it was a family function. He had his whole family there, including his sister's brand new boyfriend. Now, this boyfriend, he comes over to Timmy, kind of trying to be friendly with him. He walks over and takes a little piece of the soft pretzel that Timmy was eating. Now, when he pops it in his mouth and walks away, Timmy didn't like that very much. He's sitting here thinking inside, he stole a piece of my pretzel. What is he thinking? But what he did, rage building up inside him, he walked over with ice skates on, kicked him right in the shin. Yeah, it hurts. Let me ask you this. Have you ever thought, this is the way the world sees God? A lot of times they think of God as somebody who's ready to punish them or kick them in the shin anytime they do something that he doesn't like or disapproves of. But we as Christians, we know of something called God's grace. Now we know of God's grace because just like it says in Ephesians 2:8, it is by grace we have been saved through faith. In fact, this is the message that we have to bring to the world. This is the message Jesus was speaking of in Mark 16:15 that says, "Go into all the world and preach the good news to all creation." That good news is God's grace. Now, in order for us to tell others about God's grace, we have to understand the grace of God in our own lives. The 2 characteristics of grace I'm going to share with you today. These are very important characteristics. The first is that God's grace is for everyone. There is not one person in the world that does not need God's grace. Now, if we look in the chapter of Matthew 26, it tells us of the last night of Jesus' life before his crucifixion. Now, we'll look at 2 of Jesus' disciples, Peter and Judas. Now, first looking at Peter, we're at the Last Supper, and Jesus calls out to him. In Matthew 26:31, it says, "This very night you will fall away on account of me." And 2 verses later, Peter responds, and I can't help to think that this is a very prideful response, in saying, "Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will." And then, that very night, only hours later, he does exactly what Jesus told him that he would do. He denies him 3 times, and Peter is devastated. Now, if we look at Judas, Judas is the disciple that handed over Jesus to be killed for only 30 pieces of silver. And when he realized what he had done by handing over to his death, Judas was devastated. Now, we think of Judas a lot of times as the worst of the 2. But when you think about it, both betrayed Jesus. Now, the second characteristic of God's grace that I want to tell you guys about today is that God's grace is a gift. Now, if we look further into the verse I mentioned earlier, Ephesians 2:8, it says, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, but this not of ourselves. It is a gift from God." Now, just like any gift, it must be received and accepted into our lives. Focus again on the lives of Peter and Judas. Peter, we know by looking into the New Testament, went to do amazing things for God. But the only reason that is because he chose in his own life to accept God's grace and to trust in his forgiveness, that he would forgive him of his sins. Now Judas, when he betrayed Jesus, he learned only hours later that he handed him over to his death. And he tried to take that matter into his own hands by taking the money back to the Pharisees, tossing it in the temple. But when they tell him there's nothing they can do for him, he goes and he hangs himself, ending his life right there. Because he did not know what to do with his life and how to forgive himself of his sins because he was doing it in his own hands. The only difference between Peter and Judas, Peter accepted God's grace, Judas denied it and took it into his own hands. Now, in our mission to bring the good news everywhere, this good news of God's grace, we must remember the ancient truth. Actions speak louder than words. Now, the greatest witness to unbelievers is seeing the grace of God in our lives and the evidence of that. So let me ask you this. Are we accepting God's grace into our lives daily? Are we allowing others to see the freedom that comes from that? Or are we continually knowing God's grace and not applying it to our lives, taking matters into our own hands? I challenge you to accept God's grace into your life, and others will be able to see that in your life. Thank you.